Welcome back to The World This Week, where we check in with Paris-based correspondents for their take on the stories that have caught our attention over the last 7 days. Joining me for that is Christopher Dickey, World News Editor at our media partner, The Daily Beast, and Douglas Yates, Professor of Political Science at the American Graduate School. Thanks for being with us, gentlemen. Now, we're starting in Zimbabwe, where President incumbent Emmerson Mnangagwa has called his election a new beginning for the country. And indeed, it is a landmark moment, the first vote since the country's independence not to feature Robert Mugabe. Yet it's his party, the ZANU-PF, that's been declared the victors, prompting many to ask to what extent this is a break from the past. Opposition leader Nelson Chamisa has criticised authorities of rigging the vote and says he's going to contest it.
We are not accepting fake results. We will pursue all means necessary, legal and constitutional, to make sure that we protect the people's vote.
Now, I'd just like to start with the day's news there. We heard that the police sent journalists out of a press conference organised by Nelson Chamisa, only to let them in again. We've seen the military deployed to the streets of Harare. 6 people have died in clashes. It does suggest that the security conditions just weren't there to have a fully free and fair vote. Do you agree?
Yeah, and the problems in the capital city with the opposition are going to draw a lot of our attention, and the army is going to be there. There's going to be security problems. What we're not getting a lot of images, however, are of the countryside. In the rural areas, ZANU swept the vote, and it appears that there are not protests or manifestations. There's not a lot of violence. So yeah, in the capital city, it's difficult, but everything appears to be under control, and we're expecting in a few weeks things to simmer down.
OK, but this is all relative, of course. I suppose, you know, we can say that things are relatively better democratically than what we've seen before.
Are they really? I mean, we just don't have Mugabe anymore. We had this sort of election. Maybe it was a very good election, but there was never any doubt about the outcome. From the time of the coup that overthrew Mugabe, was there ever any doubt that...
Yeah, I wouldn't describe this as a democratic election, but it's kind of meeting the new international norm. Like, for example, the elections in Russia, where people know, of course, it's not a fair democratic election, but once you kind of have the dog and pony show, the international community is reluctant to intervene. Contrast it, for example, with Democratic Republic of Congo. There, where Joseph Kabila is not holding an election, the international community can take a stand. But it's difficult with the principle of sovereignty, once they hold an election, to do a great deal. And probably also deep down, Mugabe was such a terrible figure at the end that people are willing to do business with Mnangagwa.
Now, you speak of the role of the international community there. In this, during the post-election violence, Britain, former colonial power, was very quick to ask for the troops to be taken away from the streets of Harare. But when it comes to supporting the democratic process with observers and whatnot, do you think that Zimbabwe has had the support it needs?
Oh, I think there was just a realistic judgment that there wasn't very much you could do. You can't, you can't intervene massively and say, we're going to run your elections. You can either say, you're going to have elections, you're a sovereign state, you'll do it your way, and we will try and send observers to come down with some kind of a judgment on whether it's fair and free or not. But at the end of the day, in a situation like the one you have in Zimbabwe, there's no question that the new president is going to win by a major margin. It's probable that the opposition is going to say that there was fraud. It's probable that there will be some violence on the streets, particularly in the capital city. All of this plays out as if it's a set script. And at the end of the day, we have the new president who took power by force, just as in Egypt, for instance, another one of those countries. The president was a general who took power by force. We could go down a whole list. We are in a period, as Douglas was saying, we are in this period of illiberal democracies, where there aren't democracies at all. They're dictatorships that have elections. That's what we're looking at all around the world, and this is another example. So can you fix that by sending in lots of observers or offering support? No, you can make it cosmetically a little better, but you're not going to change the picture.
So what was the interest then of sending these international observers? Did they really achieve nothing?
Well, I saw a nice headline from hope to despair, and I think there was hope. There was hope because Mugabe had been toppled. If things had been different, perhaps Mugabe's wife would have been aligned to become president with Mnangagwa behind him. So things have changed a little. Also, there are a few policy areas where the new government might make substantial changes. One has been the rights of white farmers in the agricultural sector. One of the things Mnangagwa had said is, look at what I do. Of course, we have been, and the elections were not a good sign, but some of his policies towards trying to divert investment into Zimbabwe's agricultural sector might cut him a little bit of slack. I do also think the observers were there and they did their job. The job of the observer is to observe and to give an honest evaluation. And they did hold a conference where they did note there were serious irregularities and a lot of pressure being used in rural areas. And it's those rural areas where we don't have the images. Two kinds of pressures they mentioned. One is that aid was being distributed based on your vote and not distributed. And they can use things like previous voting patterns, but that's a serious irregularity. And the second was that traditional rulers in the villages. These are chiefs, people who have been in the distribution system of ZANU-PF and stood to lose if the opposition took control. Those chiefs were also putting pressure on people. So the observers observed. They recognized the faults. But I think the purpose of elections in an illiberal system is not to select who's going to rule. The purpose of elections in this kind of system is to legitimate power. And what the opposition had said was that if you participate in this election, you're legitimating the coup d'etat. They did participate. And unfortunately now, he's turned the page.
Well, those observations don't seem to have weighed too heavily on the Electoral Commission. Now, moving from the ZANU-PF to the opposition, the MDC, Nelson Chamisa came to this campaign as the result of the former leader, Morgan Tsvangirai, death in February of this year. How has he emerged as this reasonably successful opposition candidate who held his own in this election?
Honestly, I don't know that much about him. Tsvangirai was a figure that we all knew about and had heard about, and we saw him come very close to sharing power effectively, even with Mugabe. I thought that was what seemed to be a miracle moment some years ago in Zimbabwe. But I don't really know much about this guy. I'm going to defer to Douglas on him.
Well, one of the problems was in February, Tsvangirai died, February 14th, and the movement split. So once you have a charismatic leader and you lose your charismatic leader, what gives the movement coherence? They were ideologically defined by being against Robert Mugabe, but he had already been removed. They were, in terms of personality, defined by being for Morgan Tsvangirai. And so when both of those men were taken out of the equation, the movement ended up not having any common ground. And there was an alliance. He was a majority representative, but there's a lot of factions now. The opposition splintered. ZANU-PF is not.
OK. Well, let's move on now to another of the week's top stories, the news that Donald Trump says he's ready to meet with Iranian authorities. Well, let's hear it from the man himself.
Are you willing to meet with President Rouhani, and under what conditions? And have there been any preliminary discussions about something like that?
I'll meet with anybody. I believe in meeting. The Prime Minister said it better than anybody can say it. Speaking to other people, especially when you're talking about potentials of war and death and famine and lots of other things. You meet. There's nothing wrong with meeting.
Well, this runs counter to a message that Trump sent via Twitter just a week earlier, threatening consequences the likes of which few throughout history have ever suffered before. All of that, of course, in his classic capital letters. Now, it's certainly an about-face coming from Trump here. How do you interpret this offer of his? Is it genuine?
Well, Trump's policy toward Iran is largely incoherent. Not surprising, because that's the case with many of his policies. But with Iran, you had something a bird in the hand, as it were, with the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement. He says, no, I didn't make that deal. Obama made that deal. It's a bad deal. It's the worst deal ever. We've got to get rid of this deal. He didn't have anything with which to replace it. All he has with which to replace it is sanctions, pressure, talk, not too muted talk about regime change, and that there is going to be a lot of suffering in Iran as a result of that. But what happens with sanctions, what happens with those kinds of policies, is typically they strengthen the hardliners within a regime, which typically become more and more authoritarian, totalitarian. And I think we can probably anticipate that here. Rouhani is not the problem. Rouhani is a relatively moderate figure. The real problem in Iran is the Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. And after some of those exchanges, Rouhani said, if there's a war with Iran, it will be the mother of all wars, but we could also have the mother of all peace. Rouhani held that out. Trump completely ignored the mother of all peace side of that statement. And after his incendiary tweet, the response was actually from Qasem Soleimani, who's the head of the Quds Force, which is the expeditionary force, sort of like the Green Berets of Iran. They're the ones who train the militias, organize the militias, they're the ones who've organized terrorist acts, and they're the ones that the Americans really fear. And what did Soleimani say? He said, you shouldn't be talking to Rouhani. I'm a soldier. You should be talking to me. And we can get very close to you in ways that you cannot begin to imagine.
So they're threatening with an equal
well, they were threatening.
Weight.
That coming from Qasem Soleimani, that is a very serious threat.
Well, I want to just go back to Trump's attitude here. It does recall somewhat the North Korea scenario, where he starts off threatening on social media, even taunting Kim Jong-un with the name Little Rocket Man, and then they end up shaking hands very shortly afterwards in Singapore at that historic summit. Is this the new normal? Is this the democratic approach, the diplomatic approach that the US can now apply to any country where relations are strained?
Well, as long as Trump is willing to give away as much as he gave away to North Korea, probably we can apply it all over the world. I mean, you take a country that is the hermit kingdom, you raise it to a level of equality with the United States, president to president. You talk about this absolutely brutal tyrant as if he's your new best buddy, and you say that you've made peace and solved the nuclear problem when there's been no denuclear activity, in fact, quite the reverse. And you wind up saying, Trump is such an embarrassment. He says, oh, they've already returned 200 corpses of Americans, when in fact they hadn't returned any. Now they've returned 55. That's supposed to be a big deal. This is a ludicrous deal to deal with North Korea. And I think Trump is clearly embarrassed by it, but of course he won't give an inch.
But do you think it's comparable to what's happening this week with Iran?
My comparison with North Korea would be back in 2000. Because the deal struck with Iran was really fortunate. It was fortunate because in Iran you'd had an election that had gotten Rouhani back into power, so you had an interlocutor on the Iranian side. And in the United States you had Obama, who was willing, for a variety of reasons, to strike a deal. I think it was the same conjuncture of stars that you saw in the late 1990s with the Clinton administration and Kim Jong-un's father, Kim Jong-il, where North Korea had actually stopped its enrichment of uranium before producing weapons. And when George W. Bush came to power, he scuttled that entire deal. And that's when North Korea began producing nuclear weapons. And I think what Donald Trump has just unleashed is, if we're to learn from history, North Korea in 2000. That is, I'm expecting now Iran to pursue its production not of enriched uranium, but of nuclear weapons. And the next time a U.S. president will have to deal with them, they're going to have to deal with the nuclear power.
Well, and you have to say, what is it that Trump respects? He respects you if you have nukes, and he doesn't respect you if you don't. So he deals with Kim Jong-un because he's got nukes. He doesn't deal with Iran because, or he threatens Iran all the time because it doesn't have nukes. Then he says he will talk to Iran, but that's a reflection, once again, of Trump's idea that his personality is so powerful and his ways are so winning, and he's such an incredible artist of the deal that one-to-one contact with him is going to change the world. Well, we saw how that worked out we think we saw how it worked out in Helsinki. Who the hell knows what he said with Putin for 2 hours and 10 minutes?
Well, Trump might be zoned in on the nuclear weapons, like you say, but for most Iranians in the country, the economy, the economic situation there is their major concern. And you mentioned the nuclear deal, the famous Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. It was thrown out in May, and it's put Tehran in a very difficult position because they're in line for these punishing sanctions. Given the economic context, do you think Tehran is up against the wall and they're going to have to now come to the table with the US in return for easing of sanctions?
No, I don't think they'll do that. I mean, I really don't think they'll do that. The Iranians are very proud of their sovereignty. Lots of countries are proud of their sovereignty, Iranians particularly so. This is not a particularly popular regime. It's been there probably too long already, far too long already. But it's popular enough against the kind of pressure that Trump is bringing against it. And I don't see that there may not be a lot of support for the mullahs, but there's no support for Trump, and nobody's going to want to give in to them. And as I said before, when you have sanctions, and it's very hard to get basic commodities, who can control those? Basically, a military/mafia complex. You saw it in Iraq, which was under draconian sanctions. You see it again and again. That's what will happen in Iran. It'll make the military, the IRGC, that much more powerful.
So this week's statement's just another Twitter storm, as it were, perhaps. I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up there. Thank you very much, Christopher and Douglas, for joining us this evening. Do stay with us here on France 24. We'll be back with more news in just a moment.